You quit coding to bake pastries." My dad's voice hit the dinner table like a slap. My brother snorted. My mom didn't yell. She just said, "If you fail, don't come home begging." I was 35 years old. I didn't quit on impulse. I quit knowing exactly what it would cost me. I stood up to leave. That's when the door opened. A man I'd already met before walked in holding a folder. He looked around the table and said calmly, "Sorry to interrupt. Based on her existing contracts, we're valuing her bakery brand at $300,000 a year." No one laughed. No one spoke. For the first time that night, they had nothing left to say. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That satisfying silence, the folder in the stranger's hands, the look on my father's face when the number landed that came later, months later, after everything almost fell apart, after they tried to make sure it would. Let me go back to where it really started. Not the triumph, the table. Silence has weight. You don't notice it until it presses against your chest and asks you to breathe anyway. That first dinner, the one before everything changed, didn't end with vindication. It ended the way most of our family dinners ended, with me leaving early and them believing they'd won. I was the daughter who learned early how to be quiet. In my family, approval had a shape. It wore a uniform. It showed up as a degree that sounded respectable when introduced to neighbors. It liked numbers that climbed predictably and careers you could summarize in one sentence without pausing. Coding fit that shape. Baking never did. That was the joke. My brother's arms crossed, mouth curled like he'd just watched a trick he'd already guessed the ending to. He'd always been allowed that look. He could gamble on ideas, pivot midstream, reinvent himself every few years, and call it growth. When things didn't work, we called it experience. When I deviated even an inch, we called it instability. My dad cleared his throat the way he did when he believed he was being patient. "This isn't about laughing," he said, as if laughter hadn't already done its job. "It's about being realistic." My mom nodded once. Not agreement. Finality. She had a way of delivering ultimatums without raising her voice like she was stating the weather. "We just don't want to be dragged into something we warned you about." I didn't sit back down. I didn't defend myself. That's what they expected me to do, explain my way back into their comfort. I had learned the hard way that explanations were invitations to negotiate my life. But I hadn't stopped negotiating yet, not completely. That would come later, after I understood what they were really capable of. The dinner had been labeled a family thing, which in my house meant an evaluation disguised as concern. I'd arrived already knowing the questions I'd be asked. How long could this phase last? Did I have a plan? When was I going to return to something serious? No one asked how I was. No one ever did not when they could ask what I was doing instead. They didn't know that I'd registered the business quietly, that I'd lined up supply agreements that cared less about my resume and more about whether I delivered on Tuesday mornings without excuses. They didn't know because they didn't ask, and because I didn't tell them. There's a difference. That night, no one walked through the door to save me. No folder appeared. No numbers were announced. I simply stood up, gathered my coat, and left while they were still exchanging glances that said she'll be back. She always comes back. I walked to my car alone. The night was cold, indifferent. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, not crying, not planning, just breathing, letting the silence settle into something I could carry. They thought the conversation had ended when they laughed. They were wrong, but proving that would take everything I had, and it would cost me things I didn't know I was still holding on to. This is the story of how I got from that night to the one where a man walked through the door with a folder and a number that silenced them all. It's not a straight line. It's not a fairy tale. It's what happens when you stop asking for permission and start keeping receipts. People think I stayed quiet because I was weak. That's the version that makes sense to them. Silence looks like fear from the outside. It looks like someone is shrinking. That wasn't it. I stayed quiet because I learned early what speaking up costs, and because in my house the price was never paid once. It was paid over and over in small deductions that added up to being slowly edited out of the room. You learn quickly when your voice causes the temperature to drop. You learn even faster when you realize silence lets you stay. The first time I understood this, I was still a kid old enough to know when something was unfair, but young enough to believe fairness mattered. I had brought home a result. I was proud of something measurable, something that was supposed to count. My parents looked at it, nodded, said, "That's nice," and moved on. 5 minutes later, my brother admitted he'd messed something up badly. Instead of disappointment, he got reassurance. Instead of questions, he got context. They explained his mistake for him, softened it, and turned it into a story about potential. I watched the exchange like it was a lesson being delivered directly to me. Achievement earned acknowledgement. Failure earned protection. And the protection was louder. No one was cruel. That was the part that confused me for years. There were no slammed doors or raised voices, just patterns. Expectations were applied unevenly, but always with a reasonable tone. When my brother took risks, he was brave. When I hesitated, I was cautious. When he changed his mind, he was exploring. When I did, I was unstable. The words were polite. The message was not. I learned where I fit by noticing what didn't get corrected. By the time I was a teenager, I understood the rules even if no one had written them down. If I wanted peace, I had to be easy. If I wanted to stay, I had to be agreeable. Silence became less a lack of response and more a strategy. It was the thing that let me exist without causing friction. In my family, silence wasn't peace. Silence was permission to stay. Coding came later, but it fit perfectly. It was structured, logical, defensible. It came with titles and salaries that made sense to people who liked their lives explained neatly. I didn't choose it because I loved it. I chose it because it worked as armor. It made conversations shorter. It made introductions smoother. It gave my parents something they could say proudly without having to clarify. When I told them what I was studying, they didn't hesitate. They didn't ask follow-up questions. They didn't warn me. That approval felt like oxygen. I did well. That part is true. I learned quickly, adapted faster, and built a reputation for being reliable. The paychecks came on time. The benefits made sense. From the outside, it looked like alignment. From the inside, it felt like maintenance. I kept the machine running and myself out of the way. Every milestone was met with a nod, then immediately compared to something my brother was doing that required more emotional support. He was always on the verge of something. I was already there, which meant I didn't need as much attention. There was one colleague I respected during those years. Not a friend exactly, we never got coffee or talked about our lives outside the office. But she was competent in a way that didn't need to announce itself, and I noticed that. We worked on a few projects together, exchanged maybe a dozen emails over 3 years, and then she left for another company. I saved her contact information without thinking much about it, the way you keep things that might matter someday without knowing why. I didn't reach out when she left. Neither did she, but her number stayed in my phone, filed under a name I'd almost forgotten by the time I needed it most. The double standard at home wasn't hidden, it was normalized. My brother could fail publicly and be encouraged privately. I was expected to succeed quietly and not ask what that success was worth. When he talked about being tired, it was taken seriously. When I mentioned exhaustion, I was told everyone feels that way. When he questioned his direction, it was framed as growth. When I questioned mine, it was framed as ingratitude. There was one night years before the dinner that changed everything when I tried to say something honest. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just honest. I said I was tired. I said the work felt endless and joyless. I said I didn't feel like myself anymore. The room went still in that particular way that signals you've said the wrong thing. My dad told me not to be negative. My mom asked if I was being influenced by stress. My brother joked that I should be grateful to have a job people respected. No one asked what I needed. The conversation shifted, and the message landed clearly: honesty was a disruption. I apologized for bringing it up. After that, I learned to keep my real thoughts folded neatly inside. Baking started quietly. Not as a plan, not as an announcement, just something I did when I needed to feel competent in a way that didn't require permission. It was the one place where effort translated directly into outcome, where I could adjust and see the result without waiting for approval. I didn't tell my family. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want it evaluated before it existed. There's a difference between secrecy and privacy. I was practicing privacy. The more I baked, the more I noticed how different it felt from my day job. Not easy, just clearer. When something went wrong, I fixed it. When something worked, I repeated it. No one rewrote my intentions or reframed my motives. It was just me and the result. That quiet was different from the silence I'd grown up with. It didn't erase me. It held me. I stopped talking about my doubts altogether. Not because they disappeared, but because I understood the pattern now. Speaking up didn't lead to understanding. It led to corrections. So I built it instead. Slowly, carefully, without witnesses. I didn't need to be understood. I needed to not be stopped. By the time I finally left coding, I had already left emotionally. The job was just the last visible thread. What surprised me wasn't how hard it was to walk away, but how long I'd stayed out of habit. Silence had kept me safe. It had kept the peace. It had also kept me small. I could see that now clearly without anger. That dinner, the first one before everything shifted, didn't come out of nowhere. It was the natural result of years of being defined by what I didn't say. They laughed because laughter had always worked before. They warned me because warnings had always pulled me back into line. What they didn't understand was that I had already chosen, not loudly, not dramatically. Quietly, the way I'd learned to do everything that mattered. Staying quiet kept me safe, but it also kept me from being chosen. And eventually I had to choose myself. I didn't quit coding because I hated it. I quit because it stopped being a choice. Somewhere along the way, the work stopped being something I did and became something I owed. Not to myself, not even to the company, but to the version of me my family could tolerate. Coding had turned into a peace treaty I was required to renew every day, and the terms were non-negotiable. As long as I stayed, I was responsible. As long as I stayed, I was safe. As long as I stayed, no one had to ask uncomfortable questions. At work, the pressure didn't arrive dramatically. It crept in through calendars, filled without asking deadlines stacked on top of each other like assumptions, expectations delivered as facts. There was a project that should have taken weeks compressed into days because someone higher up had promised something early. I was looped in after the promise was made. No discussion. Just a note saying, "We'll need you to make this work." That phrase followed me everywhere. Make it work. It didn't matter what it cost as long as the surface stayed smooth. When I flagged the timeline, the response was polite and final. We trust you. Trust in that context meant compliance. The workdays stretched. I logged on earlier, signed off later, and ate meals without noticing them. Meetings overlapped. Messages came in marked urgent for problems that had existed long before I was told about them. When I fixed one thing, two more appeared quietly placed on my plate. No one asked if I had capacity. They assumed it. I was good at absorbing pressure without spilling it. That has always been my skill. It was also my trap. The first real warning didn't come from my mind. It came from my body, abrupt and uncooperative. I was in the middle of a call, listening more than speaking, when the room seemed to tilt just slightly enough to make me stop typing. I told myself it was nothing. Then the call dropped, not because of my internet, but because I couldn't track what was being said anymore. The words blurred together like they were coming from underwater. I excused myself, muted the screen, and sat there until the sensation passed. Later, a professional told me plainly that this was my system asking for relief, not demanding it. Asking. I nodded, took notes, thanked them, and went back to work the next day. I tried one last time to bring it up at home, not dramatically, not as a declaration. I framed it carefully like I always did. I said I was thinking about taking a break, maybe shifting directions. My dad frowned the way he did when he thought I was being impractical. "Don't sabotage yourself," he said. My mom asked why I couldn't just push through a little longer. My brother laughed and said everyone hates their job sometimes. No one asked what pushing through had already cost me. No one asked what would happen if I didn't. That was the moment something clicked. Not emotionally, logistically. I realized that if I waited for approval, I would never move. If I waited for understanding, I would age in place. So I stopped talking and started planning. Quietly, the way I had learned to do everything important. I didn't quit right away. I opened a separate account. I registered the business. I reviewed local regulations and requirements the same way I'd reviewed system documentation for years. I mapped out expenses and timelines, not optimistically, but conservatively. I took on small orders, then slightly larger ones, always within what I could handle without risking collapse. I built a buffer, not a fantasy, a bridge. They never saw it because they weren't looking. Baking changed once it became real. It stopped being an escape and started being work, which was exactly what I needed it to be. The first order I ever filled was for 24 lemon bars. A woman I'd met through a neighborhood group needed them for her book club. She didn't ask for a portfolio or references. She asked if I could make them taste like her grandmother's recipe, the one she'd lost years ago. I told her I couldn't promise that, but I could make something worth remembering on its own. She said that was good enough. I woke up at 4 that morning, not because I had to, but because I couldn't sleep anyway. The kitchen was cold and dark, and I stood there for a full minute before turning on the lights, letting the silence settle around me like permission. Then I got to work. The butter had to be cold. The crust had to be pressed, not rolled. The lemon curd needed to set, just long enough to hold its shape, but not so long that it lost its shine. I'd made lemon bars dozens of times before, but this time every step felt louder, more deliberate. This time, someone was paying. When I pulled the pan from the oven, I didn't know if they were right. I only knew they were mine. I let them cool on the counter while I showered, dressed, and packed them into a box I'd ordered online 3 weeks earlier, plain white with a small window on top. The drive to her house took 12 minutes. I parked, checked the box again, and knocked on her door with my heart sitting somewhere near my throat. She opened the box right there on the porch. She didn't say anything at first. Then she looked up and said, "These look like they belong somewhere fancy." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled and told her I hoped they tasted even better. She paid me in cash, exact change, and closed the door. I sat in my car for 5 minutes before driving away, not because I was emotional, but because I needed to understand what had just happened. Someone had trusted me. Someone had paid me. Not for my resume or my title, for a thing I made with my hands. I delivered my first order early because I was terrified of being late. The second one was rejected because it didn't meet a standard I hadn't been told about. A cafe owner had asked for croissants classic buttery with visible layers. What I delivered looked fine to me, golden and flaky, but she held one up to the light and shook her head. "The lamination isn't tight enough," she said. "See how the layers are uneven here, my customers notice." She wasn't unkind about it. She was just clear. She told me to try again if I wanted no pressure, but she couldn't sell these. I drove home with the rejected croissants on my passenger seat, still warm, filling the car with the smell of butter and failure. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I pulled into my driveway, sat there until the engine cooled, and then I went inside and opened my laptop. I watched videos. I read forums. I learned that lamination isn't just about folding, it's about temperature timing, resting the dough long enough for the gluten to relax, but not so long that the butter softens. I practiced 3 more times that week, adjusting the ratios, chilling the butter longer, folding more carefully. The 4th batch I brought back to her. She held one up again, turned it over, and nodded once. "These I can sell." That was it. No celebration, just acceptance. I left her shop with a standing order for 24 croissants every Saturday morning. I learned how to ask questions without apologizing, how to set expectations without overselling. The interactions were awkward at first. I was used to hiding behind credentials. Now I had to stand behind the results. When a client asked why my prices were slightly higher than the grocery store, I didn't fumble or justify. I said, "Because I make them the morning you pick them up. Because I use butter, not margarine. Because if something's wrong, you can call me directly, and I'll fix it." She nodded, handed me her card, and became one of my regulars. There were failures I never told anyone about. A batch of brioche that collapsed because I'd rushed the rise. A custom birthday cake I had to remake twice because the fondant cracked in the humidity. A week where I underpriced an order so badly, I actually lost money after ingredients and gas. Each mistake cost something time, money, confidence, but none of them cost approval. That was the difference. In coding, every failure was observed, measured, and stored for later evaluation. Here, failure was private. It belonged to me. I could learn from it without being reminded of it at dinner. The two lives ran in parallel for months. By day, I answered messages that assumed my availability. By night, I calculated margins and schedules. I slept less, but the tiredness felt different. It was chosen. That mattered. The fear was there too, constant and sharp, but it was clean fear, not the dull weight of being trapped. When I realized that the bakery was covering its own costs consistently, I didn't celebrate. I updated my spreadsheet. The morning I decided to resign, I woke up before my alarm. Not anxious, just ready. I showered, dressed in clothes that felt like mine instead of armor, and drove to the office one last time. The building looked the same as it always had: glass and steel and silence. I badged in, took the elevator to my floor, and walked past rows of desks that had never felt like home. The resignation meeting was shorter than I expected. I'd rehearsed explanations I didn't need. When the time came, I said what was true and nothing else. I'm done. No speeches, no justifications. The person across from me blinked, then nodded, then asked procedural questions. Equipment return, exit interview, final paycheck timeline. The system absorbed my departure the way it absorbed everything, efficiently, indifferently. I signed what needed signing, handed over my badge, and walked out through the same doors I'd entered thousands of times before. Walking out felt lighter than I thought it would. Not triumphant, just unburdened. The parking lot was half empty, the afternoon sun catching the windshields in a way I'd never noticed before. I sat in my car for a long time, not because I was sad, but because I needed to understand the shape of this new silence. It wasn't the silence of being dismissed or ignored. It was the silence of a door closing behind me and no one calling me back. For the first time in years, I had no meeting to prepare for, no deadline, to calculate, no inbox waiting to be cleared. I drove home the long way past the cafe that now sold my croissants every Saturday, past the neighborhood where I'd delivered my first lemon bars, past the commercial kitchen I'd been researching as a possible next step. The city looked different from the outside, less like a maze, more like a map. When I got home, I didn't announce anything. I changed into the clothes I baked in an old t-shirt, soft from 1,000 washes, and the apron I'd bought myself when the first regular order came through. I went to the kitchen, pulled out my notebook, and started planning the next week. 4 standing orders, 1 custom request, a tasting with a potential new client. The list was small. It was also real. That night, my mother called. She'd heard from someone somehow that I'd left my job. Her voice was careful, a kind of controlled neutrality that I recognized from years of navigating her disappointment. "Is it true?" she asked. I told her yes. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I hope you know what you're doing." I told her I did. Whether or not she believed me, she didn't say anything else. The call ended without a fight, which somehow felt worse. I'd expected resistance. What I got was absence, the slow withdrawal of investment that signaled I was no longer worth the argument. The fear didn't disappear. It shifted. Freedom, I learned quickly, doesn't come with guarantees. It comes with silence. The kind where no one is telling you what you should be. The kind where your choices echo back at you without commentary. That silence followed me home. It sat at the edges of conversations in the pauses where my family waited for me to say I'd changed my mind. I didn't. I just kept going. Every delivery completed, every invoice paid, every adjustment made without asking permission added weight to the decision I'd already made. Quitting was the easy part. Surviving the silence afterward was harder. But every morning, I woke up before dawn. Every tray I pulled from the oven, every customer who came back for more, each one was a sentence in a language my family had never bothered to learn. I was writing a life that didn't need their translation. I didn't come back because I ran out of money. That was the story they were ready to tell themselves, but it wasn't true. I came back because starting over still requires logistics. I needed a stable address for the LLC paperwork, a place where mail wouldn't bounce or disappear. I needed a few months to smooth out cash flow while I rented kitchen time by the hour, instead of locking myself into a long-term contract I wasn't ready to sign. None of that made for a dramatic comeback story. It made for a practical one. I didn't come back to be rescued. I came back because I was building something, and building requires infrastructure. Walking back into that house felt less like returning and more like stepping into a room where the air hadn't been changed in years. Nothing had shifted. The rules were still there, invisible but firm. No one greeted me at the door. No one asked how I was doing. The first questions came quickly and efficiently. How long was I staying? Did I need anything? Could they help? Help in that context had a very specific meaning. I said I'd be around for a bit. I said I had things handled. They nodded, not because they believed me, but because my answers didn't challenge anything. No one asked what I was working on. No one asked what my days looked like. Curiosity had never been their instinct with me. Management was. The first week I kept my head down and my routines invisible. I woke at 4 most mornings before anyone else stirred and worked in the kitchen while the house slept. The overhead light was too bright, so I used the stove light instead, just enough to see without announcing myself. I measured flour by weight, not volume. I let dough rest overnight, tucked behind leftovers no one touched. By the time my parents came downstairs for coffee, the kitchen looked untouched. The only evidence was a faint smell of butter, which I blamed on toast. It wasn't sustainable, I knew that, but it bought me time. The conditions appeared gradually wrapped in reasonable language. My mom suggested it might be better if I didn't talk too much about the bakery. People worry, she said. She mentioned not wanting extended family to get the wrong idea. Your aunt called last week, she added. She asked if you were okay. I didn't know what to tell her. My dad asked more than once when I thought I'd go back to coding. Each time he framed it like a check-in. Just curious, he'd say. The question repeated often enough to make the expectation clear. Be quiet, be temporary. One afternoon, I came home to find my mother standing in my room, holding an invoice I'd left on the desk. She wasn't reading it. She was waiting. What's this, she asked. A delivery confirmation. For a client. You're running a business out of our house. I'm using the address for mail. That's all. She set the paper down slowly. It would be better if you kept these things contained. Your father doesn't need to see paperwork everywhere. I nodded. That night, I moved everything important into a folder I kept in my car. Contracts, confirmations, client messages. Anything that proved the business was real went somewhere they couldn't casually reach. There were no explicit threats. Everything arrived as a concern. I didn't push. I watched. My brother noticed my return with mild amusement. He called the bakery a phase, asked how much I was making the way people ask about hobbies. When I didn't answer, he smiled and said I was being sensitive. My parents told me not to read it. One evening he brought a friend over for dinner, someone I'd never met, someone who worked in finance. The conversation turned, as it always did, to careers. My brother talked about his latest project with easy confidence. When the friend asked what I did, my brother answered before I could. She's figuring things out, he said, taking a little break. I run a bakery, I said. Wholesale and custom orders. The friend looked interested. Oh, that's great. How's business? Before I could answer, my mother jumped in. It's still early days. She's just getting started. I excused myself early and spent the rest of the night in my room updating my spreadsheet with numbers that didn't need translation. The days settled into a rhythm that felt smaller than my life had been weeks earlier. I was asked where I was going when I'd be back, whether I really needed to spend money on certain things. I coordinated deliveries and invoices during the day and answered questions about my whereabouts at night. I started using the commercial kitchen more often, not because I needed the extra time, but because I needed the space. The owner, Gloria, didn't ask questions about my life. She asked whether I needed the stand mixer on Thursday and whether I'd be done by 6. One morning, she watched me pull a tray of croissants from the oven. You're getting better, she said. Those layers are tight. I had been practicing. Every batch was documented temperature timing technique. I kept records that existed outside anyone's opinion, not to convince them, to ground myself. At home, I didn't argue. I wanted to see how far it went when I stopped cushioning things with explanations. The answer came quickly. Any deviation was flagged. Any inconvenience became evidence. This is what happens, my father said once after a delayed delivery. When you don't have systems in place. It's handled, I said, and went to my room. That was when it became clear. They didn't want me safe. They wanted me to be predictable. Once I understood that something shifted, I stopped reacting. I started observing. The next time there was friction, I didn't lower my voice. It happened over something small, a package with my business name on it. My mother set it on the counter. "Another delivery," she said. "For your project. For my business. I don't understand why you can't have these sent somewhere else." "Because this is my legal address. For now." "For now." I picked up the package. "Is there something you want to say?" The room went quiet. My father looked up. My brother paused mid-bite. "I just think," my mother said carefully, "it might be time to have a real conversation about your plans." "My plans are working," I said. "That's the conversation." I took the package to my room and closed the door. It wasn't a fight. It was a boundary forming. That night I organized everything. Contracts signed, payments received, deliveries completed, client communications. Not to prove anything yet, just to make sure no one else could rewrite my story for me again. Revenue was growing, slowly but steadily. Costs were controlled. Clients were returning. The foundation was there. They thought I was hiding because I was ashamed. They thought I came home because I'd failed. They were wrong. I came home to build a bridge, not to stay, and I was almost ready to cross it. If they were going to try to stop me this time, I kept receipts. People assume I didn't plan because I didn't announce it. That assumption saved me. While they waited for a declaration, a meltdown, or a confession of failure, I moved quietly the way I always had when something mattered. They thought the bakery was a phase, a distraction I'd grow tired of once reality set in. Because they believed that they didn't watch closely, and because they didn't watch closely, I had time. I didn't keep records out of paranoia. I kept them out of habit. Years in tech had trained me to document everything, to assume memory was unreliable and narratives were malleable. So I saved confirmations methodically, emails that confirmed weekly orders, messages that acknowledged receipt, transfers that arrived on schedule, delivery windows that repeated without incident. I didn't highlight them or point them out. I didn't show anyone what I was building. I built it and left a trail that wouldn't depend on belief later. There was a comfort in repetition that surprised me. The same bakery placed the same order every week without commentary. The same cafe adjusted quantities based on foot traffic and trusted me to handle the changes. No one asked about my background or why I'd left another career. They asked whether I could meet demand and whether I could do it again next week. I answered yes when I meant it and no when I didn't. Both answers mattered. The first contract I signed felt less like a victory and more like a transaction, which was exactly right. A small cafe downtown, the kind with mismatched chairs and regulars who knew the owner's dog by name, needed a reliable source for their weekend pastry case. The owner, a woman in her 60s who'd been running the place for 20 years, didn't care about my story. She cared about whether her display case would be full on Saturday morning when her customers walked in expecting something sweet with their coffee. We met on a Tuesday afternoon after the lunch crowd had cleared. She poured us both coffee without asking and sat across from me with a legal pad. "Tell me what you can actually do," she said. "Not what you hope to do, what you can do right now this week without killing yourself." I appreciated the question. I told her I could handle 40 pastries a week, a mix of croissants, scones, and whatever seasonal item made sense. I could deliver by 6:30 on Saturdays and Sundays. I could adjust quantities with 48 hours notice. I could not. I said clearly scale to daily deliveries yet. I didn't have the equipment or the capacity. She nodded, wrote something down, and looked up. "Good. I don't need it daily. I need someone who shows up when they say they will and doesn't ghost me when things get hard." She slid a simple agreement across the table. One page, quantities, pricing, delivery windows, a 30-day cancellation clause for either side. I read it twice, asked one question about payment timing, and signed. Walking out of that cafe, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt employed, in a way that finally made sense. Over time, the pattern clarified. I didn't need dozens of clients. I needed the right ones. The ones who valued consistency over spectacle, who cared less about novelty and more about reliability. Stability isn't loud. It repeats. Once I understood that, I stopped chasing validation. I focused on cadence, on showing up, on letting the work speak in intervals instead of bursts. What made my products different wasn't one dramatic element. It was an accumulation. Every choice stacked on the one before it. I used European-style butter with higher fat content. It cost more, but the croissants shattered properly when you bit into them instead of bending like cardboard. I let my doughs rest longer than most recipes called for, sometimes overnight, because rushed fermentation tasted flat. I hand-laminated everything, which took hours, because machine lamination couldn't catch the subtle variations in thickness that made each layer distinct. The scones became my signature almost by accident. A customer at the cafe mentioned she'd grown up in England and hadn't found a proper scone since moving to the States. I asked what made a scone proper. She described it precisely dense but not heavy crumbly, but not dry with a slight tang from buttermilk, and a golden crust that gave way to something tender underneath. I made 6 batches over 2 weeks, adjusting ratios each time until I landed on something that made her close her eyes when she took the first bite. "That's it," she said quietly. "That's exactly it." Word spread. The scones started selling out by 9 a.m. I tracked everything in a spreadsheet that would have looked obsessive to anyone else. Costs per item. Profit margins after delivery time was factored in. Which products sold fastest. Which ones got repeat requests. Which ones sat in the case until afternoon and had to be discounted. The data told me what my instincts couldn't, that the lemon bars outsold the brownies 3-1. That weekend mornings needed more savory options than I'd expected. That one cafe's customers preferred smaller portions at lower prices, while another's would pay more for something substantial. I stopped guessing. I started responding. At home, the commentary continued, but it landed differently. My parents asked if I'd considered applying for positions just in case. My brother asked how long I planned to keep pretending this was real. I didn't answer. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. They weren't asking to understand. They were asking to regain control. Every answer I'd given before had been used as leverage. This time I declined to supply it. One evening, my mother found me in the kitchen laptop, open spreadsheet, glowing. She glanced at the screen without asking permission. "What is all this?" she said, her tone halfway between curiosity and accusation. "Work," I said. "It looks like a lot of numbers for something that's supposed to be about baking." I closed the laptop gently. Baking is work. Work has numbers. She stood there a moment longer, waiting for me to elaborate, to invite her into the process the way I always had before. I didn't. Eventually she said, "I just hope you know what you're doing," and walked away. It was the same phrase she'd used when I quit. A placeholder for concern that never asked what it could do to help. I kept collecting proof instead. Not to win an argument, but to prevent erasure. I'd learned how easily my efforts could be minimized or reframed once they passed through someone else's discomfort. I wasn't interested in repeating that. I wanted a record that existed independently of opinion, something that didn't require interpretation. There's a strange shift that happens when you stop explaining yourself. People either lose interest or grow anxious. My family did both, alternating between ignoring my work and probing it for weaknesses. They noticed my silence before they noticed my progress. That told me enough. The first time someone outside my family asked serious questions, it caught me off guard, not because they were difficult, but because they were precise. Her name was Diane, and she'd built a small regional bakery distribution company over 15 years. We met through a wholesale supplier who'd mentioned my name when she asked about small producers worth watching. She wasn't looking to invest or acquire. She was looking to understand who was building quietly in a market full of noise. We met at a coffee shop. Neither of us frequented neutral territory. She arrived with a leather portfolio and reading glasses pushed up on her head, the kind of person who looked like she'd heard every pitch and wasn't interested in hearing another one. I hadn't prepared a pitch. I'd brought my records. "Walk me through your last 3 months," she said, before I'd even finished my first sip of coffee. I did. Revenue by week, client retention rate, average order size, cost of goods as a percentage of revenue, delivery reliability. I'd missed one window in 12 weeks due to a car issue, and I'd communicated before the deadline rather than after. She took notes without reacting. "What breaks if demand doubles?" she asked. "Everything," I said. My current setup can handle maybe a 20% increase without major changes. Beyond that, I'd need commercial kitchen space, probably part-time help, and better equipment. I've priced it out. I'm not there yet." She looked up from her notes. "Most people I meet tell me they can scale. You're the first one this month who told me you can't." "I'm not trying to impress you," I said. "I'm trying to be accurate." She nodded, took one more note, and closed her portfolio. "Maintain what you're doing for another quarter. Document everything the way you have been. If the numbers hold, we should talk again." No promises, no encouragement, just a door left open for a reason. After that conversation, I went home and updated my files, not because I was excited, but because excitement makes people sloppy. I didn't tell my family about the meeting. There was nothing to tell yet. No deal, no announcement, just a shift in how I was being seen by someone who had nothing to gain from flattering me. The questions at home sharpened as my answers shortened. My mom asked why I was always on my laptop. My dad asked whether I'd considered the long-term consequences of stubbornness. My brother joked that I was being secretive now that I had something to hide. I let it pass. I was hiding, but not from them. I was hiding from interference. Late at night, when the house settled into its familiar quiet, I reviewed everything again, not obsessively, carefully. I looked at patterns instead of peaks. I paid attention to what I repeated without effort. That was the foundation. Not a viral moment, not a dramatic pivot, just steady confirmation that the work held under pressure. There was one night about 2 months into my new rhythm when doubt almost broke through. I'd had a difficult week, a supplier issue that delayed one order, a custom cake that took twice as long as I'd quoted, and a new client who'd canceled after one trial run without explanation. I sat at my kitchen table at midnight, staring at the numbers, and felt the familiar undertow of failure pulling at me. What if they were right? What if this was a phase? What if the silence I'd chosen was just isolation in disguise? I let myself feel it. I didn't argue with the doubt or try to push it away. I just sat with it the way you sit with a fever waiting for it to break. And somewhere around 1 a.m, I noticed something in my spreadsheet I'd missed before. Even in my worst week, I'd still covered costs. Even with the cancellation, my retention rate was above 80%. Even with everything going wrong, the foundation hadn't cracked. It had just flexed. That was the night I stopped needing reassurance. Not because the doubt disappeared, but because I learned it wasn't predictive. Doubt was just weather. The structure underneath was something else entirely. I understood then why silence had always unsettled them. Silence meant they couldn't calibrate me. They couldn't tell whether their doubts were working. They had to sit with uncertainty, something they'd never asked of me before. They were used to my transparency, my explanations, my willingness to be assessed. Without that, they were guessing. They thought I was hiding because I was ashamed. I was hiding because I was negotiating, and the terms were finally mine to set. I knew something had shifted the moment the questions changed shape. They weren't curious anymore. They weren't even mocking. They were careful, calculated. My parents stopped asking how things were going and started asking how long I thought I could keep this up. My brother stopped joking and started listening too closely when I answered the phone. No one raised their voice. No one laughed. They didn't yell. They recalculated. It happened quietly, the way real damage usually does. I didn't hear about it from them. I heard it from a client who suddenly sounded hesitant, whose words came with pauses that hadn't been there before. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my car, parked outside the commercial kitchen, reviewing my delivery schedule for the week. When I saw her name on the screen, I expected a routine check-in, maybe an adjustment to her standing order. Instead, her voice carried something I hadn't heard before: uncertainty. "I just wanted to touch base," she said. "Make sure everything's still on track." "Of course. Is there something specific you're concerned about?" A pause. Too long. No. It's just someone mentioned you might be going through some changes. I wanted to make sure you're still planning to be around next month." I felt my spine straighten against the seat. "Who mentioned that?" "Oh, I don't remember exactly. It came up at a thing. Someone who knows your family, I think." She laughed nervously. "I'm sure it's nothing. I just wanted to check." I kept my voice steady, professional. "Everything is on schedule. I'll have your order ready Saturday morning, same as always. Is there anything else? No, that's great. Thanks for confirming. When I hung up, I sat still longer than necessary, replaying the conversation until I recognized the pattern. Doubt had been planted. Not loudly, not sloppily, just enough to make someone second guess. Someone who knows your family. The words sat in my chest like a stone. They didn't confront me. They talked to other people, friends, acquaintances, anyone who might cross paths with someone I worked with. The language was always the same, wrapped in concern. She's under a lot of stress. She's trying something new. We're just worried she's not thinking long term. No one accused me of incompetence outright. They didn't have to. They let implication do the work. And implication travels faster than truth. The second call came 3 days later. Another client one I'd been cultivating for months. A small grocery store that had been discussing a trial run of my products on their shelves. The owner's voice was apologetic but firm. "We've decided to hold off for now," he said. "Just want to make sure everything's stable before we commit." "Stable," I repeated. "My delivery record is 97%. I've sent you the documentation." I know. It's not about the paperwork. It's just we heard some things. Nothing specific, just... We want to be careful." "What things? From whom?" He hesitated. "I'd rather not say. Look, it's nothing personal. Let's revisit this in a few months, okay?" The line went dead. I stared at my phone until the screen went dark, then stared at the black rectangle in my hand. A few months. In business terms, that was a polite way of saying never. The first order was delayed, not canceled, just pushed back. The client said they needed to reassess their needs. The second asked if we could revisit terms later in the quarter. It wasn't catastrophic. That was the point. It was subtle enough to look like coincidence. But I'd been tracking patterns long enough to know when something didn't belong. This wasn't market fluctuation. This was interference. I started making calls of my own, casual check-ins with clients who'd gone quiet. Each conversation followed the same shape, vague references to concerns, mentions of unnamed sources, reassurances that it wasn't about my work. The work was fine. It was the situation around me that worried them. One woman, braver than the others, finally said it directly. "Your brother mentioned you might be overwhelmed. He seemed genuinely worried about you." My brother. I didn't find out because he confessed. I found out because a buyer asked me carefully whether I was sure I wanted to handle growth on my own. He said he'd heard I might be overwhelmed. The phrasing was too familiar, too personal. It wasn't a concern. It was commentary lifted from a family dinner and placed into a professional context where it didn't belong. Later, someone else mentioned my brother's name casually, like it explained everything. That's when it clicked. He'd taken it upon himself to help, using the same justification he'd always used when he undermined me. The family knows best. Family worries. The family intervenes. I confronted them that night, not loudly, not emotionally. I waited until dinner was almost over, until the plates were cleared, and my father was reaching for his second glass of wine. Then I spoke. "Who talked to my clients?" The room went still in that way it does when everyone knows the answer, but no one wants to say it. My mother's fork paused mid-air. My father set down his glass with deliberate care. My brother looked at his phone as if he'd suddenly received an urgent message. "What do you mean?" my mother asked. Her voice was light, innocent, the voice she used when she already knew exactly what I meant. "Someone has been telling my clients that I'm unstable, that I might not be around, that they should be careful doing business with me." I looked at each of them in turn. I want to know who. Silence, the kind that admits guilt without confessing it. My mother spoke first. "We only mentioned it because we're concerned. You've been working so hard, and we worry." "Mentioned what? To whom?" "Just people we know." Casually. "It wasn't anything formal." My father cleared his throat. "It's normal for families to look out for each other. We're not trying to interfere. We're trying to make sure you don't get in over your head." I turned to my brother. He was still looking at his phone, but his jaw was tight. "You told a buyer I was overwhelmed." He shrugged, finally meeting my eyes. "I was being honest. You've been stressed. Anyone can see that. You don't know anything about my business." I know you've been hiding in your room every night doing whatever it is you do on that laptop. I know you barely talk to us anymore. I know Mom worries about you constantly." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing that expression I'd seen my whole life, the one that said he was being reasonable while I was being difficult. "I was just being honest with people who asked." "No one asked." "Then I was being honest with people who should know." I felt my hands flatten against the table, steady, controlled. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me shake. "You told my clients, people I've spent months building relationships with, that I'm not reliable, based on nothing." "Based on what we see," my mother said quietly, "and we see someone who won't accept help, won't communicate, won't let us in. What are we supposed to think?" "You're supposed to think it's none of your business." The room went silent again. This time the silence was different, colder. My father set both hands on the table. "That's not how families work." "No," I said. "That's not how this family works. Because in this family, help means control, concern means access, and support means making sure I never get far enough away to stop needing you." No one apologized. No one admitted fault. Every sentence sounded kind. None of them were honest. That was when I understood the mechanism clearly for the first time. They weren't trying to stop my business. They were trying to make sure I'd never leave again. If they could make the outside world feel unsafe, unreliable, hostile, then home would look like the only reasonable option. Dependence disguised as protection. Sabotage framed as love. It wasn't about failure. It was about containment. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They trickled in over the following weeks. A contract that didn't renew. A conversation that ended earlier than expected. A polite email that said they'd decided to go in a different direction. Each one stung not because it ruined me, but because it proved how vulnerable I still was to other people's narratives. My livelihood wasn't just mine yet. It was still exposed to their reach. I spent one night calculating the damage. 3 clients had pulled back. 2 more were hesitant. The revenue loss wasn't catastrophic, maybe 15% of my projected income for the quarter, but the momentum loss was worse. Trust once shaken doesn't rebuild on schedule. It rebuilds when it decides to, if it decides to at all. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I recalculated too. I stopped sharing schedules. I stopped answering questions about my work. When my phone rang in front of them, I walked to another room before answering. I redirected correspondence to a P.O. box I rented that week. I changed the passwords on my business accounts. I tightened every point of access until there was nothing left for them to reach. And then I did something I'd never done before. I told them to stop. It happened on a Sunday morning. My mother had just made a comment about how nice it would be when I got back to normal. I set down my coffee cup and looked at her directly. "I need you to stop talking to people about my business." She blinked. "I don't know what you—" "Yes, you do, and I need it to stop. Today." My father looked up from his newspaper. "That's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" "No, I think it's clear. My work is not a family project. My clients are not people you get to reassure or warn or inform. If you have concerns about me, you can tell me directly, but you do not get to manage my reputation behind my back." The reaction was immediate and unanimous. They called me ungrateful. They called me dramatic. They said I'd changed. My mother's eyes went glassy with tears she didn't shed. My father shook his head slowly, disappointed. My brother laughed under his breath, the way he did when he thought I was being ridiculous. "We're only trying to help," my mother said. "Then stop helping." The moment I stopped asking for permission, they called it disrespect. That was the breaking point. Not because they were angry, but because they refused to see the damage they'd caused. Because even then they believed they were entitled to decide how my life unfolded. I realized silence was no longer neutral. It wasn't keeping me safe anymore. It was making me accessible. If staying quiet was what kept them comfortable, then my next move would have to be deliberate. I went to my room that night and closed the door. I didn't slam it. I just closed it, and then I sat on the bed and let myself feel what I'd been holding back. The exhaustion, the betrayal, the loneliness of realizing that the people who were supposed to want me to succeed were actively working to make sure I couldn't. Then I opened my laptop, pulled up my spreadsheet, and started planning my first real move. I stopped reacting. That was the moment everything shifted. Not because I suddenly felt powerful, but because I finally understood that every reaction I'd given before had fed the same system that was hurting me. Silence had once been my shield. Now it has become my leverage. I didn't argue after what happened. I didn't demand explanations or ask for apologies that were never coming. I simply withdrew my participation. And the absence unsettled them more than any confrontation ever had. The first thing I did was practical, not symbolic. I changed my business address. The P.O. box was small, beige, and unremarkable, a metal rectangle in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a nail salon. I paid for 6 months up front. The clerk didn't ask questions and didn't care about my story. She handed me 2 keys and a form to sign. 5 minutes later, I had an address that belonged only to me. Not dramatically, not announced, just updated in the places that mattered. Banking records, vendor agreements, delivery paperwork. I spent the next 3 days methodically replacing every instance of my parents' address with the new one. Each form I submitted felt like cutting a thread. Each confirmation email felt like breathing room. Anywhere my family's address had quietly functioned as a proxy for access, it was removed. I rerouted correspondence. I adjusted permissions. I made sure no one could speak on my behalf anymore, intentionally or otherwise. There were no speeches, no warnings, just changes executed cleanly, one after another, until the separation was complete. I reviewed my contracts next line by line, not looking for threats but for assumptions. The consultant my mother had recommended, the one who'd helped with my initial LLC paperwork, was still listed as an authorized contact on 2 of my accounts. I removed his name with a phone call and a follow-up email. Anywhere a handshake had stood in for clarity, I replaced it with documentation. Anywhere a casual introduction had granted someone indirect influence, I corrected it. I didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I didn't need to. I was taking back jurisdiction quietly and completely. Revenge doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like revoking access without explanation. Then I started calling people. The first call was the hardest. My hand hesitated over the phone for a full minute before I dialed. The client who'd pulled back after hearing concerns about my stability, I called her first. "Hi, this is a call from the bakery," I said when she answered. My voice was steady, professional. I'd practiced this. "I wanted to touch base about your standing order and make sure we're aligned for the next quarter." A pause. Then cautiously, "Oh, okay. I know there was some confusion a few weeks ago. I want to be clear about what you can expect going forward." I walked her through my delivery schedule, my backup plans, my communication protocol. I told her exactly how orders would be handled if something unexpected came up. I didn't mention my family. I didn't explain delays as sabotage or frame setbacks as drama. I spoke like someone who knew exactly what she was responsible for and exactly what she wasn't. By the end of the call, her voice had softened. "That's really thorough. Thanks for laying it all out. Of course, I want you to feel confident in working with me." "I do," she said. And I believed her. I made 7 more calls that week, not to vent, not to defend myself, just to clarify the process, to restate timelines, to confirm deliverables. The difference was immediate. On the other end of the line, people relaxed. They asked questions. They listened. She didn't sound defensive. She sounded organized. Each conversation rebuilt a piece of trust that had been chipped away by doubt. Not because I begged for it back, but because I demonstrated that I could hold it. I explained how orders would be handled moving forward. I outlined contingencies. I addressed concerns before they had to be voiced. By the end of each call, the hesitation had softened into something steadier. Reliability has a way of silencing rumors without ever naming them. As the noise faded, something else became clear to me. Proving myself had always been the trap. The moment I felt compelled to explain my worth, I'd already lost ground. Stability was the answer I'd been looking for all along. Power doesn't argue. It arranges things so arguments become irrelevant. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm in a way I hadn't been before. There were things in motion that my family didn't know about. Not secrets in the dramatic sense, but relationships that existed outside their field of influence. Conversations that had started months earlier and continued without interruption. Diane, who I'd met through the wholesale supplier, had reached out again after our initial conversation. She asked pointed questions about my quarterly numbers, not because she doubted them, but because she was tracking them. A financial advisor, someone I'd found through a small business network, not through any family connection, reviewed my books once a month without commentary or judgment. These weren't saviors. They were professionals. And they treated me like one in return. I didn't tell my family about any of it, not because I was hiding, but because their permission was no longer part of the equation. They believed I was isolated. That belief made them sloppy. They assumed silence meant retreat. They assumed my lack of explanation meant there was nothing to explain. In reality, I was building an ecosystem they couldn't reach. That's when they started calling again. Not aggressively, casually. My mom asked if I wanted to join them for dinner later that week. Just family, she said. Nothing big. My dad asked whether I'd had any luck finding stability, the word chosen carefully echoing their narrative. My brother sent a text that pretended to be light. Hey, checking in. Been quiet lately. Is everything okay? I responded politely. Briefly. Dinner sounds nice, maybe next week. Things are fine, just busy. Thanks for checking in. I didn't offer updates. I didn't fill the silence with explanations they could use. And slowly, the balance shifted. The person asking more questions was no longer the one with leverage. They didn't notice the boundary when I drew it. They only noticed when they crossed it. The first test came 2 weeks later. My mother called to ask if I'd heard from that consultant, the one she'd recommended, the one I'd quietly removed from my accounts. She framed it casually, but I heard the fishing in her voice. Not recently, I said. Why? Oh, no reason. He mentioned he hadn't heard from you in a while. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay with your paperwork. Everything's fine. I've got it handled. A pause. You know you can always ask us if you need help. I know. I'll let you know if I do. I didn't explain that I'd cut him off. I didn't tell her why. I just let the silence sit there, unremarkable and complete. When she hung up, I could hear the uncertainty in her goodbye. She didn't know what had changed. She just knew something had happened. When they realized they no longer knew who I was talking to, what I was planning, or how things were progressing, their concern sharpened into something else. Anxiety. They'd lost their vantage point, and with it their ability to narrate my life. I didn't attend the next family gathering. It was a Sunday lunch, the kind that happened monthly and always included the same performative catching up. This time I simply didn't show. I didn't announce my absence or justify it. I didn't text an excuse. I just wasn't there. My phone lit up by early afternoon. Text from my mother. We missed you at lunch. Is everything okay? Text from my brother. You're not coming. That's kind of rude. Text from my father. Rare for him to text at all. Your mother is worried. Please respond. I waited 2 hours before replying. Something came up with work. Sorry I couldn't make it. I hope lunch was nice. No argument to quote later. No emotional outburst to reinterpret. Just absence. And absence, it turns out, speaks very clearly to people who are used to constant access. The first move worked. The damage slowed. The rumors lost momentum. My work stabilized again. The client who'd hesitated placed her next order on schedule. The grocery store owner who'd put me on hold called back to say he was ready to discuss a trial run after all. Trust, I learned, is patient with people who demonstrate it consistently. It doesn't need explanations. It needs evidence. And then just when I thought I'd found my footing, something unexpected happened. A message landed in my inbox that wasn't meant for me. A forwarded email, probably accidental, with a chain of conversation visible below the main message. The subject line was innocuous, re-follow-up on preliminary assessment. But buried in the thread was a name I recognized, the consultant, and a phrase that made my stomach drop. Concerns about reliability. A question phrased just slightly wrong. A name mentioned that shouldn't have been involved anymore. The first move worked. That's when someone tried to undo it. For a brief moment, everything felt almost normal again. Orders went out on time. Clients responded with the same steady rhythm they always had. A new contract sat half-signed in my inbox close enough that I could picture what the next quarter might look like if nothing else went wrong. I caught myself thinking, maybe I'd already weathered the worst of it. Maybe the damage had peaked and was finally receding. That thought didn't feel hopeful so much as cautious, like touching ground after turbulence and waiting to see if the plane really had landed. The first sign that it hadn't came quietly the way real trouble usually does. An email arrived late in the afternoon, copied to me by mistake. I could tell immediately it wasn't meant for my eyes. The subject line was neutral procedural, the kind of thing people skim re-follow-up on preliminary assessment. Buried halfway down was a phrase that made my stomach drop, concerns about reliability. The language was careful. No accusations, no dramatic claims, just questions. Questions framed as due diligence. Questions that echoed things my family had said almost word for word. Given the circumstances she's navigating personally, we should consider whether the operational stability is sustainable long term. I reread it 3 times, hoping context would soften it. It didn't. What made it worse wasn't the doubt itself, but how familiar it sounded. Whoever wrote it knew exactly how to phrase uncertainty, so it felt reasonable instead of hostile. They didn't say I was unstable. They said the situation around me might be. They didn't criticize my work. They questioned whether external factors could affect consistency. It was the same script I'd heard at home, just translated into corporate language. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives formatted like a memo. It took me less than an hour to trace where it came from. Not from my parents, not directly. The name at the bottom belonged to a consultant I'd worked with early on, someone my family had introduced as a favor when I was first setting up the business structure. "He's helped a lot of small businesses get started," my mother had said. "It's the least we can do." At the time, they'd seemed harmless, helpful even. They'd reviewed my initial paperwork, suggested a few adjustments to my LLC filing, and then faded into the background. They hadn't been involved in months. I'd assumed they were out of the picture standing still while everything else moved on. I was wrong. They hadn't been idle. They'd been positioned. When I reached out, they didn't deny sending the message. They didn't apologize either. They spoke the way people do when they believe they're being reasonable. "I haven't said anything that isn't true," they said. Their voice was calm, almost gentle, the way someone explains something obvious to a child. I simply raised questions that any responsible advisor would raise. "This isn't personal. It's professional due diligence." "You told them I was unreliable," I said. "I told them there were concerns about stability. That's different." "Whose concerns?" A pause. Just long enough to matter. "Your family has mentioned things. I'm sure they're just worried about you." "What things?" "Just that this has been a difficult transition, that you've been under a lot of stress, that they're not sure you're thinking long term." They sighed as if this conversation was exhausting them. "Look, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to protect everyone involved. If your own family has doubts, shouldn't the people investing in you know that—" That's when it clicked. My family didn't need to touch my work directly. They didn't need to lie or threaten. They only needed to seed doubt in the right place and let someone else do the rest. They'd outsourced the damage, delegated it to someone whose involvement looked professional instead of personal. They didn't need to lie. They just needed someone else to doubt me. I asked for a meeting, face to face. They agreed, suggesting a coffee shop near their office neutral ground that felt anything but neutral. The consultant arrived 5 minutes late, briefcase in hand, expression arranged into something between concern and condescension. They ordered a black coffee without looking at the menu and settled into the chair across from me like this was a routine check-in rather than a confrontation. "I want to understand exactly what you told them," I said. No preamble, no small talk. They stirred their coffee slowly, buying time. I gave them an honest assessment of the situation as I understood it. "Based on what? You haven't seen my books in 6 months. You haven't asked about my clients. You haven't reviewed a single delivery record." "I don't need to review your delivery records to know that family tension affects business performance. It's a standard risk factor." "So you told an investor that I was a risk based on conversations with my parents, not based on my actual performance." They looked at me, then really looked, and I saw something shift behind their eyes. Not guilt, calculation. Your parents are concerned about you. They've been very open about that. When someone's own family expresses doubt about their stability, that's relevant information. I'd be negligent not to mention it. My parents don't know anything about my business. They know you, a small smile, and they know you well enough to be worried. I felt my hands tighten around my coffee cup. You used their worry as evidence against me. I reported what I observed. That's my job. They leaned back, spreading their hands as if to show they were empty. If the investor decides it's not a concern, great, but they deserve to know. I'm not the villain here. I'm just being thorough. The words landed harder than anything my parents had ever said, not because they were cruel, but because they were logical in a way that left no room to argue. Family doubt had become evidence. Private concern had been converted into public risk. I realized then how carefully this had been constructed. No single move was overt enough to challenge. No line crossed far enough to protest. Each step was plausible. Each actor could claim clean hands. I left the coffee shop without finishing my drink. The walk to my car felt longer than it should have, each step heavier than the last. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes without starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel, trying to understand the shape of what had just happened. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry right away. What I felt was a hollowing out, a sudden awareness that trust I hadn't realized I was still carrying had just been removed. Not trust in my family that had eroded long ago. Trust in the separation I thought I'd built. Trust that my work existed in a space they couldn't reach. Trust that competence could outrun narrative. I'd been wrong. They'd found a way in. Not through the front door, but through someone I'd let in without checking the locks. The drive home blurred. I remember traffic lights changing, other cars passing the radio, playing something I didn't hear. When I pulled into the driveway, my mother's car was there. I sat in the garage for another 5 minutes, gathering myself before going inside. She was in the kitchen arranging flowers she'd brought from somewhere. "You're home early," she said without turning around. "The meeting ended sooner than expected." "That's nice." She adjusted a stem, stepped back to examine her work. "Your father and I were thinking we should all have dinner this weekend. It's been a while since we've really talked." I watched her hands move among the flowers, precise and unhurried. She didn't know I knew. Or maybe she did, and this was part of it, the return to normalcy, the pretense that nothing had changed. I couldn't tell which was worse. "I'll check my schedule," I said, and went to my room. That night, after the house went quiet, I sat alone and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I made a list, not of grievances or fears, but of facts. Contracts that had held, clients who had stayed, deliverables met without exception, numbers that didn't care about family opinion or secondhand concern. The contract that had been almost finished was put on hold the next morning. The investor's message was polite, professional, impossible to argue with. "We'd like to revisit some of our initial assumptions before moving forward. Nothing urgent, just want to make sure we're all aligned. Not cancel, not reject, just pause." That word again, pause. It was enough to stall momentum, enough to put me back on the defensive. I didn't argue. I didn't send long explanations. I asked for time to clarify, time to respond properly. On the surface, everything remained civil. Underneath, I was cornered. The consequences rippled outward over the following days. A client who'd been discussing expansion suddenly wanted to wait and see. A potential new account went quiet after an initial conversation that had seemed promising. I couldn't prove the connection, but I didn't need to. Doubt spreads like ink in water. Once it's there, you can't see where it started or where it ends. There was one night, 3 days after the coffee shop meeting, when I almost quit. Not the business myself. I was lying in bed at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling, running the numbers in my head for the 100th time. The math still worked. The clients I had were still solid, but the path forward had narrowed so suddenly that I couldn't see around the edges anymore. I thought about what it would mean to stop, to admit they'd been right, to go back to coding, find another job, let the narrative reset to something everyone could understand. It would be easier. It would be so much easier. The weight of proving something to people who didn't want to be proven wrong. I felt it pressing down on me like something physical, something I could suffocate under if I let it. I let myself feel it, all of it. The exhaustion and the fear and the loneliness of fighting a battle no one else could see. I didn't try to talk myself out of it or find silver linings. I just lay there in the dark and let it be true. And somewhere around 3 a.m, something shifted. Not hope, not determination, just clarity. They wanted me to give up. They'd built a machine specifically designed to make giving up feel like the only reasonable choice. And if I did, if I let the doubt win, then every sacrifice I'd made to get here would belong to them. They would own my failure the way they'd once owned my success. I sat up in bed. I turned on the light. I opened my laptop. If this was going to survive, I couldn't fight perception with emotion. I needed someone who had nothing to gain from my failure, someone outside the web they'd woven, someone whose judgment was based on evidence, not relationships. I picked up my phone and dialed the one number my family had never been connected to. Diane answered on the 3rd ring, her voice alert despite the hour. I told her everything. I didn't need encouragement. I needed someone who wouldn't flinch. That thought settled in me after the call ended, not like resolve, but like temperature cold enough to keep things from rotting steady enough to think clearly. The investor hadn't accused me of anything. They hadn't raised their voice or hinted at withdrawal. They'd simply asked to pause to revisit assumptions to make sure the ground was solid. When the line went dead, I sat there without moving, noticing how quiet my body felt when panic didn't arrive. There was no anger to burn off, no fear to outrun, just a narrow corridor of focus opening in front of me. I didn't call anyone to vent. I didn't text a friend or replay the meeting out loud. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files I already had: delivery logs, invoices, confirmations, margins. Not to reassure myself I already knew what they said, but to decide who could look at them without bringing their own feelings into the room. I scrolled through my contacts until a name stopped me. Someone I'd worked alongside years ago, not closely, not socially. We respected each other's competence, and little else. They had never met my family. They had never heard my story. That was the point. When they answered, I didn't ask how they were. I didn't apologize for calling out of the blue. I told them what I had: a business under review, questions about reliability, a limited window to respond. I didn't explain why it hurt. I didn't frame it as betrayal. I described the situation the way I describe a system under stress: inputs and outputs misaligned, a decision bottleneck forming. Then I asked a single question. Can you look at this? They didn't say yes right away. They asked what kind of look I wanted. I said I needed someone who would tell me if the numbers held or didn't, and if they didn't, I needed to know that too. There was a pause on the line, not the kind that signals discomfort, but the kind that signals recalculation. Then they told me to send everything over. No promises, no pep talk, just instructions on format and a time they'd get back to me. The waiting felt different this time. Not anxious, not hopeful, productive. I organized files, annotated timelines, stripped away anything that could be misread as narrative. When they called back, they didn't start with sympathy. They started with questions about capacity, throughput, variance. They asked how often delays happened and why. They asked what I did when suppliers failed and how often that actually occurred. I answered, plainly surprised at how easy it was to speak when no one was measuring my tone for defiance. At one point, they interrupted me, not to challenge, but to clarify. I paused, then corrected myself. They nodded audible, even through the phone. When I finished, they said the sentence I didn't know I'd been waiting to hear. I don't care what your family thinks. I care whether your numbers hold. It wasn't kind. It wasn't cruel. It was clean. For the first time, I wasn't being evaluated as a daughter or a risk or a story. I was being evaluated as an operator. They went through my records line by line. Where there were gaps, they pointed them out without accusation. Where there were strengths, they named them without embellishment. They didn't soften conclusions or dramatize flaws. By the end of the call, the shape of my business looked exactly like it always had: steady, imperfect, resilient. The rumors, when placed next to the data, collapsed under their own vagueness. Someone saying you might be unreliable meant nothing next to a calendar that said otherwise. When we hung up, I sat back and felt something unfamiliar settle in. Being believed didn't feel loud. It felt steady. There was no rush of vindication, no urge to call anyone and announce it. just a sense of balance returning like standing on solid ground after adjusting for a long slope. The ally, because that's what they were now, even if we never used the word, didn't offer to fight for me. They offered to stand with me where it mattered. A day later, they suggested the next step not as a rescue, but as a structural adjustment. If the investor's concern was credibility, then credibility needed a counterweight that wasn't emotional. They offered to put their name alongside mine in the conversation, not as a co-owner or spokesperson, but as a verifier. They'd join the meeting, confirm what they'd reviewed, answer questions about the process. They made it clear they weren't interested in the spotlight. Their presence was a tool, not a shield. We scheduled the call. I sent a brief note to the investor outlining what we'd provide and who would attend. No defensiveness, no backstory, just facts. The response came quickly, professional and neutral. That neutrality felt like a small victory. During the meeting, I spoke less than I usually would have. When questions came, I answered them cleanly, then let my ally expand where appropriate. They didn't embellish, they didn't advocate, they verified. Each answer tightened the frame around the conversation until there was very little room left for rumor to breathe. Afterward, there was no dramatic conclusion, no apology from anyone, just a clear next step and a timeline. As we signed off, my ally said something that stayed with me. People who rely on whispers panic when faced with records. That was it, not a pep talk, an observation. Word traveled faster than I expected, not through official channels, but through the same informal networks that had carried doubt. This time, the tone shifted. Questions stopped circling me and started orbiting elsewhere. My phone buzzed with messages that weren't invitations, so much as tests, people checking whether access had changed. I kept my responses brief and courteous. I didn't explain. I didn't redirect. I let the silence do the work. At home, the change registered before it was named. My family asked questions that didn't quite land inquiries disguised as curiosity. They referenced things they'd heard waiting for me to fill in gaps. I didn't. I answered what was asked and nothing more. The imbalance grew visible in small ways, pauses stretching longer, follow-up questions stacking without answers, even if I never said it aloud. One evening, my mother mentioned an acquaintance who'd spoken highly of my work. She watched my face carefully, gauging whether I'd seize the opening. I didn't. My brother tried a joke that landed flat, then tried another that went unanswered. My father asked when the next meeting was, then corrected himself, asking if there was a next meeting. I said there was, and left it at that. For the first time, they were reacting to information they couldn't control. The ally checked in once more, not to congratulate, but to align expectations. If they questioned your legitimacy, let's make it public. The words didn't feel like a challenge. They felt like logistics. I understood then what had changed. The fight was no longer about proving anything in private rooms. The next phase would unfold where narratives couldn't be edited quietly, where presence itself was evidence. That night I stood by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one the way systems do when they're functioning properly. I didn't feel victorious. I felt prepared. The betrayal had forced me to see the board. This alliance gave me leverage, and for the first time I knew I wouldn't have to stand alone when the lights came up. For the first time, I wasn't there to prove anything. I was there because I belonged. The room was already full when I arrived, the low hum of conversation settling into something polished and anticipatory. This wasn't a family dinner or a negotiation behind closed doors. It was an industry tasting the kind designed to look casual while quietly arranging hierarchies. Tables were set with intention lighting warm enough to flatter but sharp enough to expose hesitation. People stood in clusters that shifted when someone important entered the way, iron filings move when a magnet passes nearby. I'd arrived early to set up my display. The table they'd assigned me was positioned near the center of the room, not a corner, not an afterthought. I arranged my products the way I'd practiced at home, the croissants fanned slightly to show their lamination, the scones stacked in a rustic pyramid, the lemon bars cut into precise squares that caught the light. Each item sat on simple white ceramic, nothing that would compete with the food itself. I learned that lesson months ago. Let the work speak. Everything else is noise. My name was announced without embellishment, followed by the name of my bakery. No qualifiers, no backstory, just placement. I stepped forward at the exact time listed on the program, not early, not late, and took my place where I'd been assigned. I noticed my parents a few rows back, standing slightly apart from the main cluster, their smiles practiced but uncertain. My mother wore the dress she saved for events where she expected to be introduced to people. My father kept adjusting his jacket, a nervous habit I'd watched my whole life. My brother hovered near them, scanning the room for familiar faces, ready to insert himself into any conversation that might anchor him. None of them had been asked to introduce me. None of them had been asked to vouch. As the event unfolded, it became clear where authority lived. Questions flowed toward me without detouring through anyone else. A woman in a tailored blazer picked up one of my croissants, turned it over in her hand, and asked about my lamination process. I explained cold butter extended rest times, hand-folding rather than machine. She nodded, took a bite, and her eyebrows lifted slightly. "The layers," she said. "You can actually taste each one." She took a card from my display and slipped it into her pocket without asking if it was okay. When my mother leaned toward a woman beside her and began to speak, the woman nodded politely and then turned back toward the table where I stood. My father attempted a handshake with someone I was already speaking to, his timing just off enough to register as interruption. The man smiled, finished his sentence to me, and moved on without circling back. My brother tried to humor a comment tossed into a conversation already in motion. It landed nowhere. For the first time, they were present, but irrelevant. A man I didn't recognize picked up one of my signature scones, the buttermilk recipe I'd perfected after dozens of failed batches. He broke it in half, examining the interior the way a jeweler examines a stone. The crumb was tight but tender, exactly what it should be. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and then looked at me. "Where did you train?" he asked. "I didn't," I said, "not formally. I taught myself, then spent a year getting it wrong until I got it right." He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "That's the only way that matters." He handed me a business card. Wholesale distribution, regional accounts, the kind of connection that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. The announcement came without drama. No build-up, no music cue. Diane and the investor stood together, neither in front of the other, and spoke in measured tones. They referenced performance consistency capacity. Numbers were projected briefly clean and unadorned, then replaced by the next slide before anyone could linger on them. Based on current contracts and projected growth, Diane said, her voice carrying easily through the room, "We're valuing the operation at $300,000 annually, with a partnership structure that maintains operational independence while providing infrastructure support." And she paused, then added for context, "For reference, the average small-scale artisan bakery in our region generates between $80,000 and $120,000. This operation is nearly triple that benchmark, with lower overhead and stronger margins." The valuation was stated, once clearly followed by the terms of the agreement. No applause broke out. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when recalibration is happening. People leaned back, absorbing, recalculating their assumptions. I didn't look at my family when the figure was named. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift without turning my head, the way attention realigns when gravity changes. There was no laughter, no whispering. The jokes from that dinner months ago had no place here. This wasn't a reveal meant to shock. It was a confirmation meant to settle things. Diane caught my eye from across the room. She didn't smile or nod or give any visible signal. She just held my gaze for a moment, steady and certain, the way you acknowledge someone who's earned their place at the table. I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief exactly, but release. The weight of proving myself to people who didn't want to be convinced had finally been set down. They didn't apologize. They didn't have to. The silence said enough. In that quiet, I understood something I hadn't before. Vindication isn't loud. It doesn't demand acknowledgement from the people who doubted you. It simply rearranges the room so their doubt no longer matters. As the event continued, conversations reformed around new centers. People who had once asked careful, skeptical questions now asked logistical ones. Delivery schedules, scaling timelines, risk mitigation. Each question assumed legitimacy as a given. I answered them with the same restraint I'd practiced for months. No embellishment, no defensiveness. A buyer from a local grocery chain asked about volume capacity. I told her what I could handle now and what I'd need to handle more honestly without overselling. She appreciated that. "Everyone else tells me they can do anything," she said. "You're the first one who told me what you can't do. That's worth more than promises." When someone referenced a concern they'd heard, Diane addressed it directly, citing data, then moved on. "Her delivery reliability over the past 6 months is 97%, she said. The 3% were weather-related and communicated in advance. I've worked with operations 10 times her size with worse numbers." The concern dissolved, unworthy of further attention. Across the room, my parents were being approached for the first time that evening, not as gatekeepers, but as footnotes. Someone asked my mother how it felt to see her daughter succeed. The question landed awkwardly, its phrasing exposing the assumption that she'd been a part of this ascent. She smiled too quickly, offered a vague response about pride and family support. "We always knew she was talented." She said the words sounding rehearsed even from where I stood. The person nodded and excused themselves, already looking for someone else. My father was asked what I'd studied, as if searching for a narrative that could make sense of this outcome. "Computer science," he said. "She worked in tech for years." He trailed off when it became clear the answer wasn't particularly relevant. The person asking had already moved on, their attention drawn toward the display table where people were still sampling, still asking questions, still taking cards. My brother watched all of this with a tight expression, the kind that suggests calculation rather than joy. He approached me once, waiting at the edge of a conversation for a pause that never quite arrived. I saw him from the corner of my eye, the way he shifted his weight, the way his smile flickered on and off like a faulty connection. Eventually he retreated. Later he tried again, catching my eye from across the room. I acknowledged him with a nod, nothing more. The boundary was visible now, not drawn with words but with placement. I was where I belonged. He was not. I didn't take revenge. I took my name back. That realization came quietly, somewhere between a handshake and a question about expansion. For so long, my identity had been filtered through other people's expectations, their approval serving as a proxy for legitimacy. Tonight, my name stood on its own, attached to work that spoke clearly enough not to need translation. The immediate aftermath was subtle but unmistakable. People who had once hedged now leaned in. Invitations were extended with specific dates rather than vague interest. "Let's schedule something for next week," instead of "we should connect sometime." Follow-up emails were promised and this time delivered. The social proof my family had once controlled shifted entirely to the public sphere, where it couldn't be edited or withheld. My parents found themselves answering questions they couldn't answer, fielding curiosity without context. They had no documents to share, no insights to offer. They were observers now, watching a story unfold that they hadn't written and couldn't revise. When the formal portion ended, seating arrangements shifted for the reception. Without making a show of it, I chose a chair beside Diane, not across the room, not between groups, right there. We spoke about next steps, about capacity planning and staffing, about timelines that felt real rather than aspirational. "You handled that well," she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "The questions about the consultant situation. You didn't get defensive." "There wasn't anything to defend," I said. "The numbers spoke for themselves." She nodded. "That's exactly right. Numbers don't have opinions. People do. You learn to let the numbers do the talking." My family hovered nearby, close enough to signal availability, far enough to avoid intrusion. No one invited them into the conversation. No one needed to. Later, as the room thinned and conversation softened, my mother approached. Her heels clicked against the floor in a rhythm I'd known my whole life. She stopped a few feet away, waiting to be acknowledged, something she'd never done before. "Congratulations," she said. Her voice was careful, her words chosen to sound supportive without conceding anything. "This is quite an event." "Thank you." "How do you feel?" I considered the question. How did I feel? Not triumphant, not vindicated in the way movies suggest vindication should feel. I felt clear. I felt present. I felt like myself finally without translation. "I feel ready," I said, "for what comes next." She nodded, processing something she couldn't quite name. "We should talk," she said. "Later. Somewhere quieter. There are things I'd like to say." 6 months ago, I would have agreed immediately. I would have carved out time, rearranged my schedule, made space for a conversation that would inevitably center her discomfort rather than my experience. Tonight, I simply said, "We can schedule something, not tonight." The look on her face wasn't anger or sadness. It was a surprise. She had expected immediacy. She received the process. For a moment, she stood there uncertain how to respond to a boundary she hadn't anticipated. Then she nodded once and stepped back. My father lingered, then followed her. My brother stayed behind a moment longer, watching me speak with someone who'd once dismissed him at a party years ago. The man was asking about wholesale opportunities, completely unaware of the history standing 3 feet away. My brother opened his mouth, closed it, and walked away. I felt no triumph in that, just clarity. As I gathered my things to leave, the weight of the evening settled into something manageable, even light. Winning had been easier than I'd imagined, not because it required less effort, but because it required less explanation. The harder part waited ahead, quieter and more complex. Deciding what to do with the space I'd created. Deciding how much access to grant and to whom. Outside, the night air was cool, steadying. I paused before getting into my car, aware that something fundamental had shifted. The room would remember this evening. The story would circulate without my intervention. And for the first time, I understood that power wasn't about being seen. It was about choosing where to stand after you are. I drove home the long way past the cafe that had taken a chance on me when I was just starting out. Past the commercial kitchen where I'd spent countless early mornings perfecting recipes no one asked for. Past all the places that had held pieces of this journey before tonight, made it visible. The house was dark when I arrived. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat at my kitchen table in the quiet, letting the evening settle into memory. Tomorrow there will be emails to answer and plans to make. But tonight there was just this, the knowledge that I had built something real, something that belonged to me, something no one could take away by doubting it loudly enough. I'd spent years learning to be quiet. Tonight I learned that silence could be a choice instead of a survival strategy, and that was the difference between disappearing and simply having nothing left to prove. After the event, my phone didn't stop lighting up. Messages came in waves, spaced just enough apart to feel intentional. None of them were apologies. They were check-ins, congratulations, wrapped in familiarity questions disguised as concern. They weren't asking how I felt. They were asking how much access they still had. I let most of them sit unanswered for hours, sometimes days, reading them once, and then placing the phone face down as if that gesture alone could quiet the past. Power does that. It strips language down to motive. The first call I took was from my mother. Her voice sounded softer than usual, calibrated to the moment. She told me she'd always believed in me, that she'd known I'd land on my feet. She reminded me that family is family, that whatever happened before didn't need to be rehashed now that things were good. I listened without interrupting the way I used to when silence felt safer than correction. When she paused waiting for affirmation, I realized something hadn't changed. There was no acknowledgement of harm, no recognition of the cost. Mercy was being requested without responsibility. I told her I was glad the event went well and that we could talk soon, then ended the call before she could steer it further. The boundary wasn't loud. It was final. My brother waited a day longer before reaching out as if timing might improve his odds. When he did, his tone was almost cheerful. He talked about opportunities, about how my momentum could benefit both of us. He suggested collaboration framed as support, as if the past were a misunderstanding rather than a pattern. Listening to him, I heard the shift clearly. This wasn't pride, it was the proximity he wanted. He saw the spotlight and assumed it could be shared by default. I told him I wasn't looking to expand my team right now, that my focus was on stabilizing what I'd built. He laughed lightly, said he understood, then hinted we'd talk again. I didn't correct him. I didn't promise anything. Letting the implication hang was its own answer. That night, alone in my apartment, I thought about all the times I'd forgiven too early. Every concession I'd made in the name of peace had taught them something about my limits. They'd learned I was safe to ignore that I'd absorb discomfort to keep relationships intact. Mercy, I realized, isn't virtuous when it's automatic. It's just predictable. And predictability had never protected me. We met a week later at a neutral place chosen deliberately. Not my home, not theirs. Somewhere public enough to keep the conversation contained. I arrived first, sat where I could see the door, and waited. When they joined me, there were hugs offered and received politely, the choreography of reconciliation performed without rehearsal. I let them speak, let them circle the point they were reluctant to name. When the conversation stalled, I took the lead. I didn't revisit the past, I didn't catalog grievances or demand acknowledgement. I stated the conditions, what I was willing to share, what I was not, where involvement ended and observation began. I told them I valued having them in my life, but that proximity wasn't guaranteed by blood alone. You don't get access to my decisions, my work, my vulnerabilities, just because we're related. The words landed heavily, not because they were cruel, but because they were clear. For a moment, no one spoke. The reactions came in fragments. My mother looked hurt and accused me of building walls. My father said I was changing, that success had hardened me. My brother scoffed quietly as if boundaries were an overreaction. I didn't argue. I didn't defend the choice. I let their discomfort exist without trying to soothe it. They called it arrogance. I called it clarity. The difference mattered. When we parted, there was no resolution that felt cinematic. No tears, no reconciliation, just an understanding unevenly accepted that things would not revert. On the drive home, I felt a familiar tug, the urge to soften, to explain, to make it easier for them. I let it pass. Power, I was learning, isn't about winning arguments. It's about tolerating other people's disappointment without rushing to fix it. In the days that followed, the dynamic settled into something quieter. Fewer messages, more distance. When we spoke, the conversation stayed on safe ground. Weather, schedules, neutral updates. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't warm either. I hadn't punished them. I'd simply stopped making room for behavior that hurt me. That distinction mattered more than I'd expected. Late one evening, as I reviewed plans for the next quarter, I caught myself smiling at the absence of tension. There was space now, mental, emotional, to focus on what I was building without anticipating interruption. I realized then that mercy and power aren't opposites. Mercy without boundaries is surrender. Power without restraint is cruelty. What I was choosing was something in between, something earned. Before going to bed, I scrolled through my phone once more. A new message from my mother sat unread. I didn't open it, not yet. I placed the phone on the table and turned off the light. Power wasn't about winning anymore. It was about choosing who I'd be after. Nothing dramatic happened that morning, and that was the point. I woke up without the familiar knot in my chest, without reaching for my phone to check messages I already knew would be complicated. The light through the window looked ordinary. The quiet felt earned. For the first time in a long while, there was nothing to brace for, no explanation waiting to be delivered, no version of myself I needed to perform. I moved through the start of the day, slowly, deliberately aware that this calm wasn't luck. It was the result of choices I'd made and boundaries I'd held. Peace, I realized, isn't loud when it arrives, it just stays. The bakery was running before I got there. Orders moved through the system without me hovering. Messages came in that were clear, professional, and uncomplicated. I wasn't doing everything anymore, and that wasn't a failure. It was a sign that what I'd built could exist without my constant vigilance. I signed off on a few decisions, reviewed numbers, and trusted the rest to people I'd chosen carefully. Success didn't feel like applause or vindication. It felt like a breathing room, like the ability to think a week ahead instead of an hour, like not having to justify why this life made sense. My relationship with my family had settled into something quieter, defined more by absence than confrontation. They no longer weighed in on my decisions or asked for details they didn't need. When we spoke, it was on terms I could manage. Short calls, neutral updates, no interrogation disguised as concern. They were still my family. They just weren't my authority anymore. That shift hadn't come with celebration or closure conversations. It came from consistency, from showing over time that access to me wasn't automatic and that my life wasn't open for negotiation. I used to think freedom would arrive the moment they admitted they were wrong. I waited for apologies that never came, for recognition that might have validated all the years I'd spent shrinking. What I learned instead was harder and more useful. The hardest part wasn't proving them wrong. It was unlearning the version of myself they needed me to be. The one who explained too much. The one who asked for permission to exist comfortably. The one who believed harmony required self-erasure. Letting go of her felt like grief at first. Then it felt like relief. Sometimes my mind still drifted back to that dinner, the way moments like that tend to echo long after they've passed. My father's voice, my brother's laugh, my mother's warning. I replayed it now, without anger, without the urge to rewrite what I should have said. That night didn't break me. It clarified everything. It showed me exactly where the lines were drawn and how much space I'd been giving away without realizing it. Clarity, I learned, is often disguised as pain at first. I'm not who I was back then. Not louder, not harder, just steadier. I don't need everyone to understand my choices or agree with them. I don't need apologies to move forward. I didn't become someone else to survive this. I became harder to shake. The version of me that came out the other side isn't fueled by defiance or revenge. She's fueled by alignment, by knowing what matters and what doesn't, by choosing peace without asking permission. If you've ever been laughed at for choosing differently, if you've ever stayed quiet because speaking up felt like it would cost too much, you're not alone. If you're standing at a table where no one believes in what you're building, yet that doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means they can't see it from where they're sitting. If this story felt familiar, I'd love to hear yours in the comments. And if you're still in the middle of it, still building quietly while the room doubts you, don't leave. Just keep building. I didn't win an argument. I won my life back, and I didn't need anyone's permission to do it.